Right, well, welcome to the podcast, Dr. Siebecker. It's a real pleasure to be able to connect with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, I'm excited about this, and I guess to be on air to say it, thank you for rescheduling after our time zone issues earlier in the week as well, which has been a bit of a running theme with the podcast recently.
My pleasure.
So, Dr. Siebecker, before we sort of dive into, I guess, the overall topic of today around Sibo, for people that may not be familiar with you and a little bit of your background, are you happy just to share a little bit of your story?
Sure. You mean like in terms of with Sibo or in my career?
Just generally, how have you maybe got into this space of health and who you are?
Okay. Well, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Alison Siebecker, and I got into just generally interest in health, mostly because my mom was sick most of my life. She's passed on now, but she always said, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. And I think that maybe that's because she was a very vibrant mind and very vital, but she had so many health problems, and that kept her from doing what she wanted. So that gave me a real interest early on. I wound up going to naturopathic medical school, and also I got an acupuncture degree. And I myself had digestive problems since I was about 5, which I now know is SIBO. I didn't get that diagnosis until, I was an adult. I was diagnosed with IBS at an earlier time. That's easy though. If you have a conglomeration of symptoms and nobody knows what it is, then it's called IBS. It's nothing obvious. And so anyway, I found out about SIBO actually from my old gastroenterology professor, Dr. Stephen Sandberg-Lewis. He'd read an article that mentioned it, and he didn't really know much about it, but he that's how I found out about it. I started doing research. This was about 11 years ago. I started doing research, and my mind was blown at what I found out. And I went back to him and I said, did you know about this, and this? And he goes, what? No. And so we formed a partnership, and I stopped practicing and devoted myself full time to researching. And then we were a team, and he would apply what I was learning in clinic. And then we immediately started developing, particularly I started developing classes, and we started teaching our peers. And actually, at the first big lecture I ever did, Dr. Neurologic Hobie was in the audience. And this was 9 years ago or something, 10 years ago. And she was just like, her mind was blown. She's like, oh my God. And she started since then focusing on it. And so she was sort of like my first student, who now obviously, she's a totally established colleague and peer. She's amazing. And so, it's been wonderful. So Stephen and I have been on a campaign, for 10 or 11 years to raise awareness about SIBO and teach and educate about SIBO. So what I've done is I created the first medical school curriculum on SIBO, and I've been teaching that for about 8 years. I created the first ever Sibo Conference called the Sibo Symposium. It ran from 2014. Then I helped with we had a second Sibo conference called Sibo Con. I helped create that. And I've done all these online summits and courses and everything. And I have my website is a free educational website. I started that like 10 years ago. It's called siboinfo.com. And on it goes. That's why I love to do podcasts like this. Education is my number one interest, because I'm a SIBO patient and a SIBO practitioner. From both perspectives, that's the way I can help the most. As a patient, I want to know how to help myself at home. You can't depend on your practitioner or your doctor to every time something's wrong. We need to know how to manage our own condition. It's a chronic condition for most people. So, and then as a practitioner, it can be a very tricky condition to treat. And so, I have courses for patients and for practitioners. I have a 22-hour continuing medical education course, full training, so that we don't get, confused by all the trickiness. So I don't know, hopefully that's enough. That gives you a background. My whole career is devoted to SIBO education and awareness.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that brings us up to today and picking your brain on this topic ultimately. So I mentioned off air, obviously, that we've had Dr. Jacoby on, and we've spoken about some of the categories of causes that can contribute to SIBO. And we've had Dr. Greg Nye on to give his thoughts on hydrogen sulfide and what's going on from that perspective. But I think it would be great to sort of expand on some of this as well. So what we said within Dr. Jacoby's episode is we sort of mentioned that compromised motility is thought of as probably the most common underlying cause of SIBO. So I think I have two initial questions. One would be, what are some of the things that can contribute to poor motility in the first place? So almost the cause of this most common underlying cause, as it were. And maybe just to expand on motility, so people actually have some form of understanding of what we're referring to here with things like the migratory motor complex and all this fancy stuff.
Okay, absolutely. You know, it turns out there are all kinds of diseases and even medications that can cause slow motility in the small intestine. And primarily what we're talking about there is a deficiency or dysfunction of the migrating motor complex. So while I know Dr. Jacoby would have already defined that, I better say it again what it is. It's the sort of peristalsis or motility or movement in the small intestine that happens not when we're eating. So it happens between meals or overnight when we're sleeping, basically during fasting. And it's the motion that is meant to clean up after we've eaten. It's called the cleansing wave, actually. And one of the main things it's trying to clean out of the small intestine is bacteria, also cellular debris, any leftovers, but bacteria are always coming in through our mouth and just through breathing, always passing through that area, but they're not meant to accumulate. And so this is the primary prevention actually against SIBO, and one of the main ways we clean the small intestine is with it's like sweeping. It just sweeps the area. And additionally, bile and enzymes are released at the same time. So that's kind of like the soap. So, you know, it's like soap, scrubbing, cleaning, wash it off. So this motion's very, very vital for us and to make sure we don't get SIBO. And it turns out there's all kinds of things that can mess it up. So probably the most common would be an acute disease, which is food poisoning. Really, we're talking about bacterial gastroenteritis. Because a lot of food poisoning can be from viral causes. Norovirus is the most common cause of like food poisoning, basically. And that is, we're not sure, but it's not as closely linked. So it's more when there's a bacterial cause of food poisoning. So, you know, so just because you get food poisoning doesn't mean you're definitely going to go on to get this. But the way it occurs is actually through an autoimmune process. And what happens are the toxins that these pathogenic bacteria release. One of them in particular, called cytolethal distending toxin, CDTB for short, it looks very similar to a protein on one of our small intestine nerve cells. We have these cells all throughout the small intestine. And so through a case of mistaken identity, or basically cross-reactivity, because they look similar, the immune system will target that cell, that protein on that cell, at the same time that it's targeting the toxin. And this will go on. It has to get shut off somehow. And the problem with autoimmunity is that mechanism isn't being shut off. And so what will happen is, over time, it might not happen right away. You might have had the food poisoning, recovered from that, be okay. But over time, the immune system is destroying these cells, and these cells are responsible to make that migrating motor complex happen. And so then over time, less of those cells are there. They can't really do the motion. And it might be 3 months later. It could even be 6 months later, which is really confusing to link back. Why would you think, oh, well, the food poisoning I had 6 months ago when I was on vacation somewhere, you know, maybe is why I now, you know, I'm having bloating or constipation, pain, whatever. So that's one of the main ways it happens, is through an autoimmune self-damage. Now, there's plenty others, but before I go on, just want to know if you had any comments on that.
No, that's brilliant. I think one question that might not be the best time to ask, but just in case I forget it later on, with motility, am I right in saying that we have kind of different, what's the best way to say it? We have different sort of rates of motility within different parts of the intestine.
Yes, this is one of the key things I love to teach. It's true, each organ has its own separate motility, because the organs, while they're all connected and all part of the same system, they are distinct. Like I think of them like rooms maybe in a house, like with a front and a back door, like, you know, a door that leads from one to the other. And you can close those doors and you can do all sorts of things in that room that you're not doing in the next room, you know, like a kitchen versus a bathroom, you know, versus the living room. Right. So they're very distinct. So the stomach has its own motility. The small intestine has its own motility with the migrating motor complex. And then the large intestine has giant migrating motions. It's different than the migrating motor complex. The migrating motor complex does not move through the small intestine, through the large intestine, and give someone a bowel movement. That is not the same thing. The bowel movement comes from a different motion that's generated in the large intestine. These are not connected. In fact, the migrating motor complex, many of them, the actual, we have a movement about migrating motor complex movement about every 90 minutes if everything's healthy. Not all of them even reach the full end of the small intestine. So they're not causing a bowel movement. That's very important for people with diarrhea to know, that we are interested in increasing motility in the small intestine, and that's not necessarily going to give you a bowel movement. In fact, the number one physiologic underlying cause of SIBO is deficient migrating motor complex, or motility, we could say, in the small intestine, even for those with diarrhea. So the predominant amount of people who have SIBO with diarrhea have slow small intestine motility. They got a bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine that's leading to diarrhea in the large intestine. So very, very important point. Yeah. And one other example I always like to mention is gastroparesis, which is slow stomach emptying. You can have slow stomach emptying where the food is not moving down. You can feel the food sitting there. Sometimes the food actually regurgitates. It's not like vomiting. It just sort of comes back to the throat a little. And you're nauseous and have diarrhea. So you can have super stuck motility in the stomach and have diarrhea in the large intestine. That's how it goes.
Yeah. And I think we often customers get a little bit confused with that to some degree when they think, I can't have compromised motility because I have diarrhea. So I think there's obviously just a assumption that things are moving through all of the intestine too quickly, but you've done a great job of breaking that down. Yes.
And why wouldn't someone think that? You truly have to have medical training. And honestly, most medical doctors do not get that training that I just shared with you. So look, you're ahead of everybody right now. So back to the causes of slow motility. Other things that can do it would be, for instance, like hypothyroidism. Hashimoto's hypothyroidism is the most common form of hypothyroidism. Very, very common. And we don't know all the reasons why slow thyroid or deficient thyroid leads to slow motility. There are actually 7 mechanisms of actions that are proposed, 7 theories, and I don't have them all memorized, but there's very different physiological things. But we do know when someone has hyperthyroid, they tend to have diarrhea. When they have hypothyroid, they tend to have constipation. The thyroid affects all the organs, actually, not just the small intestine, but also the large intestine. And then something like diabetes could cause slow motility. And this is because, well, first of all, it can cause gastroparesis. That's the slow stomach emptying. This is through vagal nerve damage. The vagus nerve helps a lot in the motility, regulating the motility of the digestive organs. And in diabetes, glucose is getting into cells that don't have a gatekeeper. And nerves are one of those cell types. So they can be damaged by the excessive glucose. So that's another reason. So another disease would be Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. This is gaining a lot of awareness in recent times. It was thought to be a rare disease, but isn't. It's actually not a rare disease at all. It's actually quite common. And it's a hypermobility sort of disease where people are quite flexible in their joints, like, their fingers and things. And this flexibility leads to lax tissues, and like prolapses of loops of the intestines can occur because the connective tissue is very, very loose and flexible, and it can't do the proper, contractions. And so that can lead to slow motility in diseases like that. There's also medicines that can cause it. So one of them would be opiate narcotic painkillers. These are very commonly used, surgeries, back pain, all sorts of, you get your wisdom teeth pulled. People are often on opiates for various reasons. Sometimes they have reasons they're on opiate painkillers that they can't get off. They have certain conditions that really require it. And that's a real risk factor for SIBO. Most people know that when they go on one of those types of medicines, they get constipated. Again, like the thyroid, this is one of those ones that affects both the small and the large intestine. So it slows motility through its action on nerves in the small intestine as well. And so again, it stops that migrating motor complex, and then bacteria can overgrow. There are lots of other ones, like, for instance, I won't go into the mechanisms of them all, but Lyme disease can cause slow motility. Traumatic brain injury, which is actually really an epidemic of traumatic brain injury. People don't think there is, because they think oh, I'm not in a coma, I haven't been playing football my whole life or whatever. But traumatic, I'll let you all look into it later. It's widespread. That slows motility. Parkinson's disease, systemic sclerosis, also called scleroderma. So many other causes of slow motility. Let me just think if I can think of any other ones. Well, that's probably enough right now. There's just so many. So I guess one of the things to think about from that is the fact that even just the food poisoning that I mentioned is really enough. Food poisoning, who hasn't had food poisoning? Now, understandably, viral food poisoning is more common. However, think about how many people have had multiple occasions of food poisoning, most everybody. And so just thinking of that, a good percentage of those will turn into SIBO. That might explain how common SIBO is in and of itself. But then you add in all these other things I just mentioned. Think about how common hypothyroidism is, et cetera, opiate narcotics. And another one I didn't mention was antibiotics. There's a pilot study that showed antibiotics slow the motility in the stomach. I mean, everybody's taking antibiotics. So for goodness sakes, it really helps explain how common SIBO, because SIBO is basically IBS. Most of IBS is SIBO. It explains how common it is. So many common causes.
And is there any research on just the role that stress can play from a motility perspective?
Yeah, stress can turn off the migrating motor complex. So here we're talking about like sympathetic dominance. If we just think about sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Sympathetic is, running away from the tiger, fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. So the parasympathetic state is when we have our migrating motor complex, when we can be digesting our food, we have hydrochloric acid secretion, enzyme secretion, etc. So they did a study and they looked they stressed people in a laboratory in various different ways. One of them was actually quite funny. I just want to mention they had them overnight and had them sleep, but they would wake them up at intervals with loud blaring heavy metal music and bright lights. Like,
wow.
Like you just think about these experiments, they're kind of funny actually. And guess what they found? That the migrating motor complex was turned off in stressful situations. So the sympathetic system will turn it off. And the reason why is because those two sort of oppose each other. It's like, when you're running away from the tiger, so to speak, you don't need to be digesting. It's more important that you run away from the tiger. So it's important. Being in a parasympathetic state and not in a constant state of stress is very important for our motility. Now, I will tell you that I have only ever seen one case in, my 10 years or however long it's been, where I could definitely tell that stress was the cause of that person's SIBO. It was very clear, but in all other cases, I think it's more of a risk factor piling on top of already other things that are there. Like, they're already, they have food poisoning, or they have this disease, or they have that. Stress just made it worse, or maybe made the tipping point come faster. So, so that's the truth of my clinical experience, but there's also something else here. Originally, IBS was said to be just like in people's heads and caused by stress. And we now have all of these pathophysiological mechanisms identified. And so we just don't want to go backward and be like, well, it's just because you're stressed. You know what I mean? But yes, stress absolutely plays into it. Absolutely. And we all must do stress management in our modern world. We all must. Yeah.
I definitely think I've seen clinically the role that stress can play in sort of inhibiting progress as well. So when you put the program together, or it's contributing to a flare up, that's where I think it really comes into its own, the stress elements.
Absolutely, I agree. Absolutely.
Okay. So with all of that in mind,
there was another question you asked me in the beginning. You wanted to know the cause of slow motility, and then maybe was it something about the prokinetics or something? I'm not sure. I'll let you lead.
Yeah, I think it would have been. So I think my plan was for us to go into sort of the underlying causes, talk about motility, and then obviously talk about, well, what are some of the strategies and the solutions that we have to support motility if it is compromised? So that kind of leads us into prokinetics, I guess.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure I answered your question. So so prokinetics are just this wonderful category of medicines that I was not taught a thing about when I was in medical school, but I had to learn about them by treating Sibo, because Dr. Pimentel, who's our lead researcher in Sibo, he had created an algorithm years ago for treating IBS with Sibo, and he had prokinetics in there, and he'd done a study on them as well, and really found that what they did was extend remission periods. So basically, the main thrust treatment for Sibo is to attack the bacterial overgrowth head on with some kind of antibacterials. There's all different ways we can approach that. And once that is completed, and the bacteria is eradicated, there's a high chance of relapse. The reason for that, just briefly, would be primarily because of the underlying cause. The Sibo is always caused by something. And I just mentioned all these things. Well, diabetes, we don't have a cure for. I'm just using that as an example. The food poisoning that causes this autoimmunity, we don't have a cure for. And so if we don't know how to eliminate these diseases, these causes of Sibo, well, then the Sibo can just return. That would be sort of the primary reason why Sibo might relapse so frequently. So what he was trying to do was come up with a strategy to extend the remission period and make it so people don't relapse as frequently if you cannot get rid of the underlying cause. Now, just one little thing I want to say is all of what I'm just saying here requires thought about the underlying cause, and it's really, really important to have a practitioner that is looking and trying to identify what the underlying cause is, because what if it is something that can be gotten rid of? And one other thing is, just because an underlying cause can't be gotten rid of doesn't mean it can't be very well managed, and so that you don't have symptoms, and so that your Sibo hardly comes back. So having said that, so therefore he found that prokinetics can extend remission up to 8 months extra than if you hadn't used a prokinetic. And in average, it was about 5 to 6 months. In the least that it did was about 2.5 months. Who would not want an extra 2.5 months of remission, right, of Sibo? So what are these medicines? They could be prescriptions, pharmaceuticals, or there's natural herbal agents as well. His study focused on the prescriptions, of course, being an MD researcher. But what they are items like prucalopride, which in the UK is sold as Resolor. In some countries it's sold as Retitran. And finally, we got it in the US, and I think it's called Motility. I have to remember, it's just still kind of new. I just think of it as prucalopride. We also have low-dose erythromycin. That's an antibiotic that many people are familiar with, often given to children for ear infections. But in low dose, it doesn't work as an antibiotic, and it works as a prokinetic. And then we have low-dose naltrexone, or LDN for short. This is not technically a prokinetic, but it's been studied and shown to have prokinetic activity. And before I go on to the natural ones, what prokinetics do is they coordinate and amplify gastrointestinal motility, and they have different sites of action. So prokinetics generally work more so like in the esophagus, the stomach, and the small intestine. Now, depending on the dose, like if you make the dose go higher and higher, they can then also work on the large intestine. And we see this with prucalopride. It's been studied for chronic constipation in 2 to 4 milligrams. But when we reduce the dose down to 0.5 milligram, so much smaller, it does not produce a bowel movement. So this is important for patients with diarrhea to know. And in fact, it just works on the stomach and the small intestine. So it's sort of like if you really just keep pushing, you might get the effect down lower. But so it's important to know that. And this coordination of gastrointestinal motility is very important, because I mentioned people who might have slow stomach emptying and the food is sitting in their stomach. What a prokinetic can do is actually close off the top sphincter, or the top door to the stomach, and open the bottom door so that the food only has one way to go and it won't come back up. That's that coordinating of the movement. It's always to be in a downward direction. So that's how it's supposed to go. So now back to the natural agents. Actually, there's one that I want to mention that's pharmaceutical called domperidone. It's sold as Motilium in many countries. In the US, it's been taken off the market. You can occasionally get it through a compounding pharmacy because it has some safety concerns. But honestly, the safety concerns have been reviewed again in the literature recently. And they're really, I think they might have been overstated. Those safety concerns might have been overstated because it's a very widely used prokinetic. And my patients from the UK and other countries, many of them are on it with no concerns at all. And it's very effective. So I did want to mention that's another one. Now, for the natural ones, we have Iberogast, which is originally a German herbal combination. And then we have ginger root. That's usually taken at about 1,000 milligrams at night before bed. And then we have now all of these formulas where they use ginger root and maybe 5-HTP and some other ingredients, but they're all based around ginger root. And I just call them the ginger-containing prokinetic formulas. So we have things like Modal Pro, Motility Activator. In the UK, you have bio.me.kinetic. We have Sibo MMC, Prokine is another one, and I think GI Motility Complex. And I think those are all the ones that there are. In about 2 years ago, all of a sudden, like 4 more products were made. It was like, oh my God, everyone's joining in here. And they're all good. I've used them all. I have many of them in my home and I've used them with patients. I don't have a favorite. Really, I don't. And same thing with the prescriptions. I think I might have a favorite in Procalpride because it is the most effective. Absolutely, we get the strongest, best effectiveness, and it's completely safe. And so that's one of the issues with prokinetics as a category in terms of the prescriptions. Many of the medicines have had safety issues. Cisapride and metoclopramide are examples. These are classic prokinetics with serious safety concerns. And so many prescribers, many physicians only are aware of those. And they want to stay away from this category with a 10-foot pole because it's unsafe, but they don't know about the safe options. They don't know about them. So often we need the patients to educate their prescriber on safety. And Procalpride is really one of our best options. All of my gastroenterologist colleagues say it's the best prokinetic they've ever used in their patients. That doesn't mean you have to choose that one. I don't make a preference of what I use. I discuss it with patients. We did together decide what we think is the best option. Many, many, many patients respond beautifully, perfectly to the natural options. One last thing I want to say before I let you break in here and comment is okay. The dosing, they're all taken at night before bed because back to that study I mentioned about stressing people in the laboratory overnight. The interesting thing in that study is that that nighttime stress still did not inhibit the migrating motor complex. The daytime stressing did. And overnight is when we have the strongest migrating motor complex occurring because we're not eating. We're sleeping, we're not eating. And it can really do its work. And we want to take it at night before bed because we've got this big stretch of time where the migrating motor complex will occur. And what we're trying to do with these prokinetics is just sort of stimulate whatever amount of migrating motor complex we can. We know that we have diseases and things inhibiting it, but there are still nerves there that can do it. And if we use these medicines, it will just allow it will encourage and allow whatever amount we can do to happen. And so we take them all at night before bed.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so you've probably answered my questions around prokinetics already, actually, because I was going to ask around sort of when and how to take it. And a question that was popping up to me that you've pretty much answered was around the comparison between the natural ones and the pharmaceutical ones. And I think that you've cited before a study using Iberogast showing it to be as effective in sort of a research study compared to the pharmaceuticals. Is that right?
Cisapride and metoclopramide, which are heavy-duty prokinetics, and it performed as well. In fact, a little better in some of the studies. This was not a study on Sibo. The only prokinetic study on Sibo was the one Dr. Pimentel did, And he studied actually Tegaserod, which is sold as Zelnorm in the United States. That was removed from the US market for safety concerns. Back on actually now, it's back here again, and low-dose erythromycin. And he found Tegaserod to be more effective than low-dose erythromycin. Well, prucalopride is the safer, in fact, even more effective replacement for Tegaserod. But yeah, Iberogast compared as well to cisapride and metoclopramide. And this was in a functional dyspepsia, sort of a stomach prokinetic study. Most of the prokinetic studies are done actually on the stomach, but we can translate that easily. One thing to know there is that there are two places the migrating motor complex can begin. One is in the stomach. When it begins in the stomach, it then travels through also the small intestine. And then the other place it can start is right in the small intestine. The one that begins in the stomach is actually thought to be a bit stronger and more important. So we actually want to use prokinetics that have been studied and shown to stimulate the stomach. So those are very comparable studies. So yeah, Iberogast is a star in my mind.
Brilliant. And I guess just to reiterate something you said earlier on, which is the migratory motor complex kicks in sort of in between meals and in a fasting state. And this is why we have some of the dietary recommendations we have in the Sibo world. Because can you just sort of touch and expand on that for us as well?
Yes, this was Dr. Pimentel's original idea all those years ago, 15 or more years ago. And we call it meal spacing. And I mean, I guess you can consider it a form of intermittent fasting, so to speak, which is that you don't take any food or snacks or any beverages with calories. And actually, he also says no non-calorie sweeteners, so like no stevia, no aspartame, etc. Because he says it will convince the brain and the body that food is coming. Actually, it stimulates receptors that do that. But no calories in between meals. And originally, his recommendation was 3 to 4 hours of no food, no calories. But then he switched it to 5 hours, if possible. Not everyone can do that. And what I always like to tell everyone is I instituted that in my patients when he did that. This was many years ago. And I noticed a dramatic difference. The patients noticed a dramatic difference in their overall well-being. And it really, really clinically makes a difference if you can go 5 hours. So, but if you can't, go 3. You know, if you can go 4, go 4. But it really makes a difference. And it gives time. What we're doing is giving time for those 90-minute migrating motor complex cycles to come and clean out the small intestine. It really, really helps.
Perfect. Yeah, I can certainly vouch that for some clients, it's a huge game changer.
You've seen it too.
Yeah, definitely.
Have you noticed between 3 or 5, 3, 4, 5? Have you noticed that?
I can't say definitively, but certainly just focusing on avoiding snacking, grazing, and focusing kind of on your 3 square meals a day for some is enough. And then I've definitely had quite a lot of clients over the years comment on sort of genuine intermittent fasting and noticing an improvement as well. So whether that's just extending the overnight fast, for example.
Exactly. I have too. And you know, a lot of people their concern with it is, what if they're underweight? And in that case, you know, these are all just clinical suggestions, and you always alter everything to the person in front of you or your own situation. And so in that case, you know, we'll try to get at least one meal spacing period in, and maybe don't worry about the rest. Even just one is helpful. You know, you just work with what you have in front of you. Or maybe you do a meal space between breakfast and lunch and dinner. But then you have dinner, and then you have dessert, and then you even have another dessert or something. I don't know. You do what you have to do.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we've talked about motility, the migratory motor complex, what can contribute to dysfunction in it. We've mentioned the role that prokinetics can play and different options available to us. You touched on or mentioned the idea of pancreatic enzymes and bile. And I always refer to them as some of those endogenous defense mechanisms against SIBO that are involved within this. Now, I have a question, and I've heard you answer this before. So I'm partly curious whether your thoughts have changed. Or I guess, yeah, just what your thoughts are now, because it's something I've never had the confidence, I don't think, to really say in public, but it's been a thought of mine, which is, if we have all of these endogenous defense mechanisms that prevent SIBO in the first place, and if we, to some degree, maybe ignore some of the underlying causes you've mentioned, if we're able to resolve those underlying issues, so if we're able to support motility, or if we're able to support pancreatic enzyme production, bile production and flow, let's assume the ileocecal valve is happy, etc. I've always thought that without necessarily the use of antimicrobials or antibiotics, at least in theory, we should be able to eradicate the overgrowth, because we're dealing with these endogenous defense mechanisms that for decades potentially have prevented SIBO from developing in someone. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are here. I think, in theory it makes sense, but in practice, I'm wondering whether there's a different story there.
Yes, this is all theoretical. So long as we're now entering into theoretical discussion. And when I'm going into theoretical discussion, I usually like to look at both sides of it, because we don't know. So let me take the negative side first, which would be that it wouldn't work. And what that would be about is, we have seen so many examples of situations where basically, once you get an overgrowth established, in other situations, we could say an infection, like think of it as like if we have a parasitic infection or something. If you get, the cause is gone and you get, all your defense mechanisms are back online, still you might need some help. The body might need some help because there's an extra load. If you could just decrease that load. So we do see this as an example with parasitic infections. I don't treat that, but my colleagues who do, I'm not a specialist in that. My colleagues who do say you do need to actually treat that to get it out. And then once out, the body with all its good mechanisms will let you not get it again. So there is absolutely that thinking, because a lot of people have thought, well, why can't you just, take hydrochloric acid enzymes, etc., and a prokinetic, and can't the prokinetic just push it out? I think if the person, the issue is we're talking about people that already are compromised. So do we know that their migrating motor complex is now 100% working? And if so, we probably didn't even need the prokinetic now, because if it's 100% working, So I really do feel I really do believe I have seen and feel there are situations where we're going to need the additional help of knocking down the load, the bacterial load. Now, on the other side, I hear stories about people who use alternative treatment methods. And by the way, I just would love to mention, I don't know exactly when this is going to air, but I have a brand new Sibo Conference coming up on all new alternative approaches to treating SIBO, none of which are antibacterial.
Amazing.
Not a single one. The name keeps changing at the conference because I work with marketing administrators who handle that. So I'm not going to say the name, but it's going to be mid-November and it's going to be free. It's in summit format, supporting my complete desire to educate always. So I really hope you'll join me for it, because it's amazing. So some of these methods are things like Annie Hopper's dynamic neural retraining system, DNRS. And she does have cases of people who self-report that they've had SIBO. Now, were they tested and diagnosed officially as having SIBO? I think some of them were, who did tried all kinds of antibacterials in the past, still had their SIBO, still had their symptoms, did DNRS and were completely healed. And so this would indicate what the positive side, like, yes, it could work, because what DNRS can potentially do is it retrains the brain, which then affects the vagus and the immune system and all of our functioning of our defenses to come fully back online. So I believe that it is absolutely possible. And I think that these kinds of approaches, it's why I'm doing a whole conference on it, are extremely important. But they're not traditional. They're not standard. We have to learn about them and we have to try using them. And we might now gather some more cases. So I guess my answer is a bit wiffly-waffly, because I can see either side being true. And I think it might just depend upon, do we have some of these wonderful special new treatments that we can use in our armamentarium?
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I guess to also jump onto the side against the theory for a second, I'm sure I've seen a paper once that talked about endotoxins and LPS actually impacting on the migratory motor complex. So if there is an overgrowth there, that is also directly impacting on motility. So you end up in a bit of a vicious cycle in the first place.
Yeah, there's always these perpetuating vicious cycles. Actually, one of the remedies that I think is very helpful, that's an alternative remedy that will be featured in this conference, is serum bovine immunoglobulins, or IgG, basically IgG, because that binds and reduces the LPS, the endotoxins. And so I think that can be a very helpful assist in seeing what you're trying to do. And actually, I'll have two phenomenal people speaking on that. One is Dr. Lenny Weinstock, who did one of the research papers on it. So I invite everyone to come and learn more. It's a very fascinating treatment.
Yeah, this episode will be going out beforehand, so hopefully everyone will have heard that and will be joining that.
I can hardly contain my enthusiasm about this conference. I am not speaking on any of these alternative treatments. I gathered all these other people. I've been listening as they've been sending their recordings, and I've just been thrilled to learn. So
brilliant. Okay, is there anything else on the sort of prokinetic side of things that we haven't yet mentioned?
No, I think that covers it well.
Okay, that box is ticked. Okay, so with that in mind, I know that we mentioned off air that hydrogen sulfide could be something else that we kind of touch on. And I think that would be really great. So we've had the wonderful Dr. Nye come on recently, who has shared his thoughts and insights on hydrogen sulfide and what might be going on. And he sort of explains his I think he refers to them as kind of buckets of causes that can contribute to issues in sulfur metabolism. So I understand from what we said off air that you have some different thoughts around this as well. So I guess just to throw the ball into your court, Dr. Siebecker, where do you think is a good place to start with this topic?
Well, why don't we just start with the new test that's come out? Because that's really the most exciting news. And by the way, Dr. Nye is a dear friend of mine, and I love him. And I've recommended him to, all these educational venues. I love to hear his thoughts. So I just don't want anyone thinking, I don't even necessarily disagree with him. I think he's fabulous. And I just have some different thoughts, So the hydrogen sulfide test has just been released. We've not had this test all along. We've been able to test for methane and hydrogen, but not hydrogen sulfide, because the technology was not yet developed. And after many years, it has been. And it was created by Dr. Pimentel, and he's done some research studies with it to validate it. And it's now released commercially, and it's only available right yet in the United States, unfortunately. It will come to other countries, I don't know when. But it's called Trio Smart because it tests all three gases, and it's by Gemelli Labs, Gemelli. And this is really amazing because we have not been getting the full picture of what's going on with patients, and we've always known it. We all knew we needed to test hydrogen sulfide. So up until this point, the only way we could detect hydrogen sulfide on a test was with a pattern that's called a flat line. And what that's about is that because basically hydrogen gets converted into methane or hydrogen sulfide gas. And so if a person was converting their hydrogen into hydrogen sulfide, all of it, then that would mean, so like just very strong hydrogen sulfide case, that would mean that there would be no hydrogen and there would be no methane because on the test, because all of the gases that we test for wouldn't show, and everything would be in hydrogen sulfide. And we're not testing for hydrogen sulfide, so we would see zeros. And so that would just create a line like this of all zeros across the test. But what we learned when Dr. Pimentel started doing research on this is that it was actually a fairly rare case of hydrogen sulfide that would show a flat line. And so what this means is we've been missing the majority of people who actually have hydrogen sulfide because they didn't have a flat line. But then we don't see the hydrogen sulfide. And where this really comes out is, SIBO has been, for many of us, a very tricky condition to treat and manage. There are always easy cases. There are lots of easy cases. Wonderful, it's easy. It's when it's not easy, when the ones that don't just get handled. Okay, what about them? Well, in those cases, there's a lot of fiddling, a lot of trickiness. And what I think good portion of this might have been is that we were missing a third of the information that we needed. And so we can intuit a lot of it, obviously, when you're working day in with this. And we give various doctors, myself included, identify patterns, and we give names to these patterns, and we talk about them. We would, like myself and Dr. Sandberg-Lewis, talk about like pissed off bacteria syndrome and all these various things that we clinically see that I think many actually relate to the missing information of hydrogen sulfide. And the other big thing here is in treatment. Nobody has known how to treat hydrogen sulfide. So just briefly, the recommendations we've had, originally, Dr. Pimentel has recommended treating it like we would normally based on gas. If you have a predominance and bowel movement pattern, a predominance of diarrhea versus constipation, we have different antibiotic treatments. And he just recommended doing that. Well, I did that all those years ago, and I never found it to work. However, 4 of my colleagues have found that to work. I'm always sampling and asking my colleagues. So apparently I'm the odd one out. However, I will say that I do see, as a specialist, I see, particularly challenging cases. So that could be why. Some of the other treatments that have worked that I identified, long ago, just reading literature, is bismuth subcitrate or bismuth subnitrate. It can bind hydrogen sulfide, and it's very effective, actually. So, but the problem is, how do you get it? You really do need it mostly compounded. That's what really works well. So for practitioners who can't prescribe, then what are they left with? They're left with over-the-counter, like a Pepto-Bismol-like product, which then you have to take a lot, and you get a lot of salicylic acid in there, which can damage the stomach lining. So, the options are limited for non-prescribers. Recently, I just learned about some other treatments that a colleague of mine was doing that he cites success with, and I haven't tried them yet. And that would be Augmentin and Bactrim. These are prescriptions as well. And then for herbal, Uva ursi and silver. I myself have found high-dose oregano to work at times, not quite as well as the bismuth. So you see, we're all hodgepodging it here because we're all just on our own trying to figure out what works and then sharing it with each other. But now, Dr. Pimentel has finally identified the main bacteria responsible for producing hydrogen sulfide. He hasn't revealed it to us all yet because it's being published in spring. That paper, I think, has already been submitted. So he's not allowed to speak about it until it's published. So we only have a matter of months to wait. And once we know what organism is causing this, we then have a much better target. If we're going to take an antibacterial approach, we were talking about alternative approaches, but that is going to be extremely helpful because back to my original idea here is tricky treating people. If we haven't known if we haven't had the right medicines to target somebody with hydrogen sulfide, they had hidden hydrogen sulfide. We didn't even know it was there. That means they had some bacteria. We didn't even know what they were. Maybe we didn't have the right treatments. Then we're not having success. We try all these things. It works a little, doesn't really work all the way. It's tricky. What do we do? Well, finally, we're going to have all the information we need. So I think it's a double-fold thing here. Having the test, which hopefully will come to the rest of the world soon, because we need to be able to identify those people, and knowing what the right treatments are going to be. So it's extremely important. One last thing before I stop on my long thing here is the other way we've been able to identify is with symptoms. And again, everybody has their own collection, but I had many hydrogen sulfide patients years ago, and I collected a conglomeration of symptoms that I saw clinically, a pattern. And I've been teaching that out for many years. And so I can share that with you. And those are things like, this is in addition to your typical Sibo symptoms, all your standard Sibo symptoms. But it's things like irritable bladder symptoms, like a interstitial cystitis type symptom pattern. So frequency, urgency, irritation with urination. The other one would be peripheral paresthesia. So basically peripheral neuropathy, numbness or tingling in the hands, feet, fingers, and toes. These are all because hydrogen sulfide is actually toxic when in excess. It's toxic to the nerves and mitochondria of cells. So it can damage potentially the detrusor muscle of the bladder. This is a theory from Dr. Weinstock. It can affect those nerves, nerve endings. Another thing would be maybe potentially light or noise sensitivity. the sort of sulfur smelling gas that could be farting, burping, or breath, I find that to be quite rare, but it can occur. That's what everyone thinks of. Oh, well, that's how you know if you have hydrogen sulfide. Honestly, I'm not sure I've had a single patient with that who had hydrogen sulfide, like a flat line, you know. The other thing is body pain. And so this is like a fibromyalgia type body pain. It's not joint pain. It's more like muscle body pain. And fibromyalgia is highly linked with hydrogen sulfide. Now, in terms of the Sibo symptoms, what it's been linked with is diarrhea, heartburn, and abdominal pain. So also, you know, visceral pain, particularly bladder, pancreas type pain. There's a lot of studies on hydrogen sulfide and actually pancreas pain. So these are the types of things you could look for. And one last thing would be sulfur food sensitivity. So, you know, this is not compatible with the Sibo diet because it's most all meats, eggs, and there's many sulfur foods, and those you can look up those online to see all the sulfur foods. Okay. So there. Now I'll stop and give you a moment to come in.
No, that's brilliant. I think the only question that comes up for me is whether you have any thoughts around, I guess, ignoring the fact that we've got Dr. Pimentel's announcement coming up in regards to the bacteria. If we go back to what we, I guess, have been exposed to so far around things like D-cell Vibrio, etc. Do you have thoughts, or have you come across what might contribute to an overgrowth of some of these more traditional hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Dr. Jacoby had done some research and postulated maybe D-cell Vibrio could be the overgrown, could be the organism coming. What seems very likely to me is that it would be the very bacteria that have been found to be overgrown in hydrogen Sibo, which is E. coli and Klebsiella, because, and also he found a little bit of Aeromonas as the main overgrown bacteria in hydrogen Sibo, because they are, E. coli and Klebsiella are hydrogen sulfide producers. And so Dr. Pimentel's been hinting for quite some time, where he says, you know, the diarrhea that we've always seen associated with hydrogen might in fact be from hydrogen sulfide. So that's a little hint there as well, right? And it turns out the main bacteria that are overgrown in hydrogen are hydrogen sulfide producers. So it could be those. But he has said that it's a surprise. It'll be surprising. It'll be like he's basically said, I think you're all going to be surprised. So what does that mean? I don't know. So we'll have to find out. But it really does make it, it does make it hard to know what to use for treatments, but we have found things that have worked. I mean, the bismuth absolutely works. Often the high dose oregano works. And I've recommended that, you know, I've been teaching that for years. And like Dr. Weinstock has said, that's worked in many of his patients. So, but we'll find out, won't we? And then once we get the test, that's when we can do before and after testing and really figure it out. Did I answer your question? Did I go in the right direction?
Yeah. No, you did. That was great. And I guess a sort of a follow-up question to that is something I've spoken to labs about over the years is, and this is purely theoretical, I guess, ultimately as well, but the idea that if you have, let's say, Klebsiella overgrown in a stool test and someone is, I guess, expressing all the typical Sibo type symptoms, can we start to potentially speculate that we've got this kind of migration of these bacteria up into the small intestine where they're producing these gases?
Two very interesting things there. One thing, it's just a personal interest for me, but you know, many of the experts in Sibo have talked about a back migration, so that the large intestine bacteria migrate backward and upward into the small intestine, and that causes the overgrowth. And I want to say that I myself, from all the reading I've done, even from studies back in the 1920s, never agreed with that. And I really felt that it was bacteria in the small intestine itself that was overgrowing. And I just, as a personal thing, want to share that Dr. Pimentel has recently come to agree with me. So I am thrilled that what made sense to me is turning out to be correct in the science. He's working on a huge multi-year project of sequencing the small bowel microbiome because that has never been done. And it's called the Reimagine study. And he's just finding astonishing thing after astonishing thing, because it's all new. No one has ever known. And so he is finding that all of the overgrown bacteria in Sibo were already there. And so it's now looking like they truly were just from, they lived already in the small intestine in very small numbers. But to your other question, now you have to remind me what it was. It was a good one.
Oh,
The larger part of the question.
Well, I think ultimately,
Oh, it was about the stool. Can you get a sense from a stool test? So this one is unfortunately, no, you can't. And why I'm saying that is because now we should ask people who do it on all their patients, stool and breath test. But because I did that in the beginning, and what I found, this was like 10 years ago. In fact, I used to do double stool tests because, it's always unclear how reliable Evergrain is, So I would do 2 stool tests and a breath test. And what I found, it was a complete crapshoot. Crapshoot. As to whether the stool test would line up with what we were seeing in the breath test. So there were lots and lots of people who had SIBO, overgrowth in the small intestine, whose stool tests were perfect. Like there's nothing wrong in the large intestine at all. And then there are other people who do have a dysbiosis or an overgrowth that can be seen that could correlate with SIBO. But since I would say it might have been 50-50. So that would lead me to say, no, we can't. But then could we for some? I mean, maybe you could say if it's there, if it's positive, then maybe there's a correlation. But if it's not there, you can still have it in the small intestine.
Right.
So, but I would really like to hear from people. I'd like to hear more recent data from people who just do both on all their patients. And what do they find? Because you hear all these different things. Like just as an example, the Heidelberg test for hydrochloric acid assessment in the stomach. One of my colleagues did that for 10 years here in Portland. And his rates of what he was finding of how many people had low stomach acid and how many people had high stomach acid, it used to be he would find more had high. And then he's found about an equal amount of both low and high. And then by the time of his career ending, he was finding 60 to 70% had low stomach acid. Now, I was just talking to Dr. Sam Rabar, a wonderful functional gastroenterologist in LA, and he says predominantly he finds people have too much stomach acid.
Wow.
So you see, this is why we need to do large scale studies, because the information that comes from each person's office can be so different from one another. It's why I'm always asking my colleagues, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? To try and get a good beat on it, especially as an educator. So I don't know, please ask that to other people and let's find out.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. I mean, I've done a fair amount of stool and SIBO testing simultaneously. And to be honest, I'd probably say it could be 50-50, like you say. There are certainly some people where there's some beautiful correlations that you can, theoretically connect dots with. But other times, as you said, there's just no real correlation there at all. And I spoke to a colleague, we both worked at his clinic in London where I used to do some work. And in his breath testing, he was just always seeing methane dominant results. And I was always just seeing hydrogen. And it was just so strange that there was such a strong trend that we were seeing opposite, so to speak.
It is weird how that happens. That's why we have large scale studies, so we can correct for that kind of difference.
Yeah, it is interesting. Brilliant. Okay. Is there anything that we haven't mentioned from a hydrogen sulfide perspective? Is that box ticked there as well, do you think?
I think it's ticked. Okay. We went over symptoms testing, the new results that'll come out. So
yeah, I guess for listeners tuning into this, we've contacted the lab in regards to the hydrogen sulfide test, because as soon as we heard it was out, we were like, oh my God, we need access. So yeah, it's exciting to see when that will be coming to the UK.
Yeah, I think their issue is the time it takes the gas might degrade while it's being nailed, and it's quite fragile. That's why it took so long to develop this testing. They had special bags and all sorts of things for make sure it wouldn't degrade. They have to test it pretty quick.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got are they looking at, do you know if they're looking at sort of solutions for that? Is there going to be a way that they think of stabilizing the sample?
Actually, I think they've already stabilized it. Actually, it's really interesting. They, the original studies that Dr. Pimentel did had a certain level of what was positive for hydrogen sulfide on testing. And then he actually had to develop an even more stable way to handle it. and that changed the value actually. So now there's a new interpretation criteria for hydrogen sulfide. So they've actually already stabilized it even more.
Wow.
Two things I just want to mention on that is what I've heard from them is what they're looking to do is eventually, I mean, this may change, but sell the machines overseas so that you'll be able to have a quick analysis. You'll have your machine nearby. And the second thing is that for those of you who are familiar with listening to me, I teach a slightly different test interpretation than the North American breath test consensus, only ever slightly. But I just want to stress that for hydrogen sulfide, we do need to go by that lab's interpretation criteria. They have actually established through research the interpretation criteria for hydrogen sulfide. I never recommend looking at a lab's interpretation for hydrogen and methane. I recommend every practitioner interprets hydrogen and methane themselves with proper criteria. But hydrogen sulfide, you do need to use theirs.
Okay, good to know. All right. So with that in mind, Dr. Siebecker, is there anything else that you would like to kind of share with our listeners? Anything that you're kind of itching to speak about, or?
No, those are the main things that, we've heard about. The developments are so exciting. Stay tuned for all the stuff that's coming out of the Reimagine study. And I invite everyone, well, and it's free, come to listen to this fabulous, like basically new approaches to SIBO treatment, next steps for tough cases. Alex will be sure to share the information with you so you can get it to your listeners.
Yeah. And if people are just like dying to know more and sign up, is there a website up already and things that people can access?
Very soon.
Okay.
I'll make sure that we get the link to you.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.
And actually also, I guess one other thing is, if anybody's listening and they're interested in always learning more about SIBO, I do recommend you sign up for my free newsletter, because I share all the new studies that come out, and you can just sign up on siboinfo.com. I send a quarterly newsletter 4 times a year where I just tell all the big things, and then in between I send information about events that are occurring, like this conference. So it's not like, some people are like, I signed up but I didn't hear anything, because I don't send things all that much.
Sure. No, I can testify to it being a very good email to sign up to.
Oh, thank you.
It's a great resource, because there's so much content in some of those that it can take me a day to go through it, but it's very valuable.
It takes people weeks. Well,
yeah.
Each quarter also I put all the studies, and a lot of people don't even look at that, but for probably like yourself, people who like to geek out, it takes quite some time to go through it all.
Yeah, it does indeed.
But yeah, why I think it's important is particularly when interpretation criteria, sometimes it changed, many years ago. I remember when Dr. Pimentel changed his criteria of methane to 3, I put that in the newsletter. These are things you might need to know that when the test comes out, so it just helps you stay in tune.
Yeah, definitely. Excellent. Dr. Siebecker, thank you so much for sparing some time to come and speak with me. It's been a real privilege.
Oh, it's just my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. And hopefully we'll stay connected. And if you do, let me know once the website's up and the contact details for the conference. I will be sure that we put that anywhere and everywhere so that our listeners can access that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
That's all right. My pleasure. And hopefully I'll speak to you again soon.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Siebecker.
Bye.